but I'm going to give you an overview, nevertheless, about what I'm going to talk about. As an outsider, so from the point of view of psychology, and in line with my historical interests, I'm going to tell you what my understanding of social engineering is. Within that, I'm going to highlight an important change of concept, which I'm going to detail. In the middle of the 19th century, social engineering was part of the terminology of emerging sociology. Then I'm going to talk briefly about psychology. Then I will try to compare social engineering and psychology. I'm going to use smaller than, bigger than, or equal to, half seriously. That's why I have a question mark there. And then I try to pin down social engineering as an applied version of psychology, which has certain consequences when we compare this to other applied psychological areas. For instance, how this is related to generalizations and theories, or the praxis of applied psychology, even in a different context. And then I'm going to show you a few tables which are used to compare the methods of gathering information in social engineering with information gathering and psychological research. I hope it's going to be quite useful, this comparison. These are non-intervening or non-reactive psychological methods. And then at the end, I may touch upon a few ethical issues, obviously not concerning bad-intentioned social engineering, which is obviously not limited by ethical issues or restrained by ethical issues. Rather that psychologists quite often, cheat their subjects and put them to risk. So how psychological codexes and committees deal with such issues. And before coming to the details, I have to thank for the invitation by Hactivity's organizers, and that they gave me a chance to reconsider what I believe about the connection between psychology and social engineering, how this operates really in the field. You're going to hear about that in the next presentation. I'm going to start with two notes. One is that for the most part, I'm going to use the terminology of psychology. But psychology is encompasses quite a number of fields and ways, so we could talk about psychologies, which I'm not going to do. And there will be certain references to the ways various schools of psychology deal with the subject. Social engineering, likewise, could be used in plural, social engineerings, but I'm going to stick to the singular. And my second note of limitation is concerned that basically, instead of the psychology of hacking, going to compare social engineering and psychology. The psychology of hacking would be a broader enterprise, and only one aspect of that would be the implicit or explicit psychological insight employed by those engaged in hacking, and the other aspect of the psychology of hacking would be that the hackers, the persons or groups, should be characterized by social psychology. I don't want to get into these arguments, which you find often in newspapers, like people who do hacking are lonely or had a poor childhood or something like that. Or if they do it in a group or team, then they are typically deviant groups. I don't want to get into such, I believe, relatively cheap arguments. So limiting the scope of my presentation to social engineering, the psychological principles in it, and the connection with psychology. Of course, we could join psychology to IT in several ways. There's a caricature, a funny caricature from a collection which concerns psychoanalysis. Here you see the old psychoanalyst who deleted all the files on his laptop accidentally, so the patient should retell the story of his entire life. Obviously, this concerns only recording information. Now, I'm coming to what I believe how the concept of social engineering changed. Originally, social engineering was meant to mean some sort of positive change of the society. This term appeared first in the middle of the 1800s by a philanthrope, the social engineer. It's an essay containing mixed views, but the main direction, nevertheless, will be continued in sociology, which is emerging in those times. William Bodor, who used to be the president of the American Association of Sociologists in 1929, who talks about the social engineer as the person who's applying sociologies. Many believe that they naively thought that in some sense society can be researched, problems can be identified, and certain partial problems could be reconstructed in an engineering manner so that we could intervene properly in education, in the fight against poverty, or any kind of general social problem which the social engineer can repair then, or introduces measures to implement such repair. In the history of sociology, it turned out that it was quite a naive view of how the society operates for several reasons. And obviously, agents, institutions, and other actors in the society, their operation was imagined quite a materialistic way. Like, for instance, an engineer, the objects that he's working with. There are several problems, parties who have conflicting interests in social processes and so forth. And Later on, I'm going to try to compare the methods of social engineering and sociological research. The people as self-determining agents include knowledge about them and they use it in their behavior, which makes any forecast of their behavior rather difficult. So in this sense, in the final, how should I put it, context is independent, or there is no independent explanation of human behavior. So this relatively optimistic or naive idea is still there in sociology, although it is quite criticized. Now this changes, I don't know exactly when, but then this term gets a totally different meaning, a much narrower meaning. This is concerns activities mediated by IT devices, mostly illegal ways of obtaining information. So from the intention to better society, it's going to be quite a specific, focused enterprise, as you may well know, which is the current practice of social engineering. There are always changes of meaning in language, and linguistic experts always talk about the relations of parts to the whole and so forth. But what is more relevant to us here is that it is obtaining information known by someone by certain mechanisms or processes. Very briefly, a few words about psychology. There are various definitions in great psychological schools. There are certain figures of the history of psychology. You can talk about psychology as behavior, mental operation, as a you can talk about introspectional psychology, behaviorism, psychoanalysis, and today, first of all, about cognitive psychology. I'm not going to detail those, but there is another possible aspect about the possible reduction of psychological phenomena. Part of them can be found in biology, like proximal causes, like the operation of the nervous system. There are various levels of reduction, and then evolution, which reflects a holistic approach of. And psychology is a hybrid science, partly social science, partly natural science, and can also work with reductionist models, historical or social reductionist models. The way you could divide up the realm of psychology. I don't really want to get into this. This is just a background as to what kind of social engineering I'll try to compare psychology with. Not quite seriously, but I construed a few relations. This is smaller than, equal, and bigger than with respect to psychology. First of all, let's take a look at equal. More or less, it is true to say that Social engineering and psychology are both interested in the operation of people and the organizations created by people. They want to understand and forecast that behavior or interpret that behavior. So that would be the identity between them. Now, there's another relation according to which psychology is in some sense narrower, with lesser influence or ambition concerning the events of the world than social engineering. Now, the first point could be here that in psychology, normally you don't have a clear criterion, don't have clear criteria about the success of theories, or in contrast to social engineering, where you either are successful to gain information and gain control over the processes or not. This is relatively simple to decide. A second point that could be mentioned here is that social engineering is really more successful than psychology in discovering human conduct in a different context. As social psychologists, I really like Goffman when he talks about fieldwork. And we're going to see that that is infiltration into some organization for the social engineer. Then he claims that we do something like spies, only spies are more successful than us. This is what I'm referring to in the second point. And this third statement, which claims that social engineering is more powerful and more effective than psychology, is that the results of individual projects in social engineering may have much greater effect on the world than psychology ever attempted. What I think about that are serious events like WikiLeaks incidents which involve social engineering. Now, the third possibility, which very politely I left at the end, is that in some sense psychology is more comprehensive and social engineering is part of that. The arguments that are that to gain information about the soul and to use that information controlling or gaining influence or to gain self-knowledge. And compared to that, social engineering simply wants to gain information or get control. Now, as a footnote, I should say that good intention social engineering or social engineering audit is really self-knowledge, is work at self-knowledge. The second point is that psychology tries to use all kinds of information in the examination of human conduct, even such information that the people are not aware of. Psychoanalysis is a fundamental example, but it appears in other schools of psychology as well. For instance, in cognitive psychology, this is called automatic processes. Compared to that, social engineering is first of all interested in information that is already possessed by someone. Now, the third point is that psychology aims to find general explanatory principles, general interpretative frameworks, compared to which social engineering is less ambitious.
Tulajdonképpen ezt mint egy
Basically, as a summary, or
or maybe highlighting a couple of patterns of all this mess, it is possible that psychology is identified as some kind of a science, or the social engineering as a package of best practices. So I think the social engineering could be some kind of applied psychology. Of course, it has a number of consequences. The application, okay, um, it is an old one. Aristoteles introduces a lot of episteme, a theoretical knowledge, a technique that is a technical practice. I think social engineering can be localized here, and
gyakorlatok szintje lenne, és hát ezeknek a relációi.
is there anyone listening to the English channel? Okay, so and of course we should not go back to Aristoteles because the applied basic relation of applied and basic sciences, and of course why you don't if you consider the mushroom picker, that you can see that my daughter is gaining some knowledge on the mushroom, but that means a lot of practices, not necessarily an organized knowledge. Even so, it could have very serious consequences. Now, compared to that, a mycologist, a scientist, could have a completely different set of knowledge. He could have, of course, knowledge on wild mushrooms, but not necessarily so. So the theoretical, there are certain differences between applied and theoretical psychology, and it could be used to research the relationship between psychology and social engineering. First of all, that social engineering is a very practice-oriented activity. And of course, that is true to other applied fields of psychology, and that the personal qualities and features of the practitioner have a significant influence, for instance, the flexible use of strategy. And this could prove more important than theoretical knowledge or analytical knowledge. I think this kind of knowledge, if we look at the clinical psychology, case studies and a personal experience based on very interesting stories that are not necessarily general rules, could be rather relevant. And these personal stories could be applied to a given circumstances. That is the skill that a good social engineer should have. And the other thing is, what are those strategies obtaining information, both in terms of psychology and social engineering? And I think this is going to be the more detailed part of my presentation. In psychology, you can group methods in different groups, like obtrusive methods, and also methods of verbal answers. And there are different groupings. What is more relevant for social engineering is that obtrusive and not unobtrusive methods, because social engineer does his activity in secret, in a way that the observed person should not know about that. So I think I just try to draw a parallel in that respect. Of course, the motives are slightly different. For the psychology and the social engineering, because in psychology the secret is more specified. What is the secret? And of course we have to obtain that in a confidential secret way. There are also problems, moral problematic issues, and for instance occasional homosexual activity. This is morally not a preferred way of sexual behavior. Therefore, an open question about that is not necessarily efficient. Also, when there is an illegal behavior, for instance, if the psychologist wants to obtain the motives of heroin addicts, this is also not very easy to get through questionnaires, for instance. You need to get to the users and to observe their behavior. Of course, it has some certain practical consequences. In the time of AIDS and HIV, it is very important to know what is the actual practice of needle sharing and and hepatitis as well. So it's a lot to know that a lot of people share the filters, and filters could get contaminated. And of course, for that, you need to get amongst the heroin addicts just to get this information. Of course, if there is a health policy where there are certain activities and interventions like providing them sterile needles, filters, then of course it helps in avoiding the HIV and hepatitis to spread. And there are also other issues that people do not really disclose. For instance, domestic violence, where you need to use unobtrusive search. And there is also a reason why the psychologists use this methods is the avoiding impression management, because the psychologist is dealing with a subject that is self-defining in some respect, and that knowledge is built into the next behavior. Now, making an impression is a problem because when the subject of psychologist search gets an idea of what the search is targeting, then the subject tries to behave like he or she thinks is expected from him. So, for instance, if you search attitudes towards different ethnic groups, then it could be a very simple way search to do a representative survey. But for that, the of course the the respondents know what the questionnaire is designed, but there are also a way of using the lost letters method. So you just lose a couple of hundred or place a couple of hundred of letters all over the city, and they are addressed to the Roma civil organization, for instance. And you just check the results of how many of those lost letters are posted by the founders, and with the by the number of letters received, you can unobtrusively conclude or make a conclusion of which group or which category responded in what way to that. Of course, we do not know exactly what person, but we know which district or which part of the city was involved. And just to make the picture a bit more complex, unfortunately I couldn't make it simpler. So this is what I ended up with. Of course, sometimes the social engineer is present, sometimes is not present. The next is what kind of information is collected. It could be that the situation is intact, and sometimes
használ. Van egy csoport, amikor pedig preparált szituációkat használ, ezek a terepkísérletei a pszichológia.
And I will give you an example later on. What I wanted to show in the next columns is that the analysis is for the remains of human activities or real activities like talking, speaking, footprints, whatever. And amongst the remains you have two groups, objects and symbolic products. They could be visual or textual. And also the objects could be subdivided for constant and changing. For instance, if something is eroding or growing. And let's just give you an example how the growing could be informative. For instance, a toreador, if you look at the
Válkozása a bikaviadal előtt. Ha nagyon
of the facial hair before the bullfight, and you can see how it is growing and how many, because if he is for instance nervous, he could cut himself when he's shaving, so that's also one aspect. And as mentioned, that these are symbolic products, textual or visual, and these could be official or private, handmade, printed, digital, and so on. Now, altogether, we can say the social engineer collects all kind of information. This is a light blue box. And under psychologic title, you have the official proceedings like garbage analysis. And through that, you could look at what the households consume. I'm not going into details. Also, I mentioned the erosion. For instance, what is popular, how a rug is eroding, and also there are visual studies, textual studies, and so on and so on. And let me just give you a couple of examples for them. I mentioned the garbage analysis, the erosion of the carpet. I mentioned the bullfighter's bird, and since I'm running out of time, the textual documents are very interesting. The first that socialists studied the Durkheim suicide statistics study. These are, if you like, official texts, but there are also private texts. One of the earlier sociologic monography, Thomas Zdaniecki's work on the Polish peasant in the U.S. These are partly based on analysis of private letters sent by Polish farmers from the United States to Poland. And for instance, harvesting the crop and also storing the crop. And the immigrants behaved in Minnesota very much the same way as they did in Poland. And of course, a lot of studies are written about chat forums and the content on that. There are also visual documents. For instance, they studied different drawings in public lavatories. So there are where the photos of public beaches are analyzed just to look at the different grouping of peoples based on of race, and also bugging, for instance. There also and also looking at the way of interactions. For instance, Schlaghoff and Jefferson just got access to a couple of hundreds of police telephone calls, and they were analyzing the structure of the beginning of the conversation, and then the participant observation, where the Goffman study that was made in a mental hospital, and basic, yeah?
Igen, szóval értik, vagy
And also working at a petrol station, went to Las Vegas to do, who was a dealer in a casino, and based on that he made a study. Also, Humphreys analyzed in the 60s short homosexual intercourses in the public toilets. Usually that involves only two people, but there is also a third one required who just guards them from third parties, and he was this third person. And then there is a trap that I called for social engineering, and these are the field experiments. For instance, Rosenhan asked 8 participants to apply to different mental hospitals, and they applied. They said that they were hearing no voices. They were accepted, They were kept for 1 and 2 months without one was diagnosed as a schizophrenic, and the other one also some other were diagnosed as maniac depression. So if you like, they already hacked psychiatry this way. And Rosenhan published this result. A lot of people doubted it and questioned, challenged it. One of the mental hospital also questioned this study, and after that sent there to this institute a lot of patients, and 41 of them were diagnosed as people not having any mental disorder, while they had, in fact. So a lot of information is obtained through an unobtrusive way. So a lot of psychologists work as a social and act like social engineering. So if this is psychology and this is psychology is built, then it is the psychology of the losers. Now the question is that this knowledge and gain knowledge, is it really useful for non-losers? And for the social engineering, I just wanted to identify a couple of aspects, and also I have localized and highlighted, as in other fields of applied psychology, personal skills and the usage of a flexible usage of methods could be rather interesting. And as for the good clinical psychologist, this is a proper way, and not just to learn all the works of Freud. Even though I still have 1 minute to go, I would just close my presentation. Of course, as for the ethical question, because in terms of social engineering, it is not relevant. What psychologists do, just write different code of conduct that is, of course, a recommendation. Also applies for animals, or patients, or for researchers. For the researchers, the informed consent is the general principle, and when there is it's not possible, then in the US, each and every research has to be monitored by the ethical committee, and they just have to judge what is the obtainable new knowledge and what damage it represent to the observed patients, and based on that judgment the committee decide. Of course, this is not very relevant to the social engineering activity. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.